The Weight of Still Water. Chapter 1. The Man Who Tried Twice. There are people who call this office knowing exactly what they're doing, and there are people who call the way a drowning man throws anything that floats, not because he's chosen it carefully, but because it's there and he is running out of time to be selective. Daniel Farrow called on a Wednesday and again on a Friday. Both times I answered. Both times he identified himself as a logistics coordinator at a company called Meridian Freight Solutions, said the matter was urgent, and asked to speak with Nero Wolfe directly. Both times I explained the standing procedure. Wolfe does not take calls from unknown parties. I am his confidential assistant. Anything requiring Wolfe's attention could be routed through me, and I would make the determination. Both times Farrow said he understood. Both times he said he'd call back. On the Friday call, before he hung up, he said one thing he hadn't said on Wednesday. He said, "Tell him it's about something that shouldn't exist." I wrote that down. I looked at it for a moment. Then I wrote beneath it, Meridian Freight. Import-export documentation, something that shouldn't exist. I did not bring it to Wolfe that afternoon because what I had was an atmosphere, not a fact. And Wolfe runs on facts the way other engines run on fuel. I put the note in the pending drawer and went back to the correspondence on my desk. Farrow did not call again. The following Tuesday morning, I was at my desk when the phone rang, and it was a detective named Renata Voss from the 76th Precinct, and what she told me was that Daniel Farrow had been found dead the previous evening in a private cargo warehouse in Red Hook. Crushing injury. A container that had shifted, the kind of accident that happens in warehouses when safety protocols are treated as suggestions rather than requirements. She had his wallet. Inside the wallet, along with $43 and a transit card, was one of our business cards with the address of this brownstone on West 35th Street. On the back of the card, in careful, unhurried handwriting, were three things: my name, a notation reading Wednesday 10 a.m., and beneath that, underlined once urgent. I said, "Detective, when was that written?" She said the ink was consistent with the rest of what was in the wallet. Not recent, at least a week old. I said, "Thank you, I'll be in touch." I hung up and sat with the phone in my hand for a moment. Then I took the note from the pending drawer and looked at it again. Something that shouldn't exist. I thought about a man who had tried twice to reach this office and had died 4 days after his second attempt, who had kept a Wednesday appointment in his wallet the whole time he was trying. I thought he tried twice. He should have tried harder. Then I thought, no, he tried exactly as hard as someone tries when they believe they have time. I went upstairs. Wolfe was in the plant rooms with Theodore, standing before a Cattleya persivaliana in full bloom, holding a magnifying glass with the absorbed completeness he gives to orchids and to very little else. He did not look up when I entered. Theodore gave me the look he always gives me when I interrupt, and I returned the look I always give him, which is a form of mutual professional acknowledgement we have developed over years. I said a man named Daniel Farrow called this office twice last week, requesting to speak with you. He told me the matter concerned something that shouldn't exist. This morning the police told me he's dead. He had our address in his wallet and my name on our business card with a Wednesday appointment he never kept. Wolfe turned from the orchid. He looked at me with the expression that means two things are arranging themselves in his head. He said his occupation. I said logistics coordinator at a freight company, Meridian Solutions, import and export documentation. He said, and his description of the problem, something that shouldn't exist. I said yes. He was still for a moment. He said a man working inside freight documentation who describes his problem in those terms is not describing a procedural irregularity or a financial fraud. He is describing cargo, something physical, something that was moved through his hands that he could not account for within any legitimate category. He paused, and he brought it to a private investigator rather than the police or a lawyer. That is a specific choice. It is the choice of someone who understood that his problem required discretion above jurisdiction. I said, which narrows the field of who might have sent him. He said considerably. Meridian handles freight from multiple international origins. For Faro to describe his problem in those terms and to route himself toward private rather than official recourse, his referral came from someone who operates specifically at the intersection of unusual international cargo and the need for discretion over procedure. He put down the magnifying glass. Claudette Brown has been building a file on anomalous customs filings in private freight operations for the past year. She mentioned it in passing when she was here in the spring. Meridian's filing pattern would be exactly the kind of anomaly her research surfaces. He looked at me. Call her. Ask her if she referred Faro. I went downstairs and called Claudette Brown. She answered on the second ring. Before I could give her the full version, she said, "I heard about Faro this morning. I was going to call you. I said, so you sent him." She said yes. She said she would come to the brownstone at 2 o'clock and she would bring everything she had assembled. And then she said, "Archie, what I found in that warehouse is not a paperwork problem. It is something of a completely different category. Make sure Wolfe is in a listening mood." She hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment. In 20 years of investigative journalism and private research, Claudette Brown had developed a voice that was constitutionally level. She presented information the way good architecture presents itself, so that the structure was apparent before anyone had been told what they were looking at. She did not dramatize. She did not exaggerate for effect. She reported. She had sounded like a woman who had seen something she couldn't put back in its category. I spent the 2 hours before her arrival doing what I do when I have a shape without a center, filling in the perimeter. Meridian Freight's public filings were clean in the way that companies running secondary operations keep their public faces clean, which is to say comprehensively and expensively. Daniel Faro's professional history was 9 years of complete invisibility. No flags, no investigations, not so much as a late filing attached to his name. A man who had been, professionally speaking, exactly as present as necessary, and no more. I thought about what it costs to maintain that kind of professional invisibility for 9 years. I thought about what finally makes a man like that reach for a telephone and call twice. At 1:50 I put the coffee on. At 2 o'clock exactly, Claudette arrived. Chapter 2. What Claudette carried. She looked the same as she always did. Close-cropped, grey-streaked hair, dark blazer, the worn leather document case that had been expensive when she bought it and was now distinguished in the way that things become distinguished when they have been used consistently and well. She shook my hand at the front door and walked to the office without needing to be directed. She had been here before, and she moved through the brownstone the way people do when they respect a space without being uncertain in it. Wolfe was behind his desk. He acknowledged her with the slight incline of his head that constitutes genuine warmth in his register. He gestured to the red leather chair. She sat and placed the document case across her knees and did not immediately open it. She said, "Thank you for seeing me quickly, Mr. Wolfe." He said, "You sent Faro to us. You are therefore implicated in his death, to the degree that your conscience will calculate independently of anything I say. I expect your cooperation to reflect that calculation." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said yes. I was at my desk with my notebook open and my pen in my hand. She opened the document case. She said, "I need to tell you about Faro first. What he was doing matters as much as what he knew. Then I need to show you something." Wolfe said, "Proceed." She said, "Daniel Faro spent 9 years at Meridian, performing what was officially documentation, coordination, and was actually something more specific. Meridian maintained its legitimate freight operation as a surface. Underneath it they ran a secondary service for clients whose shipments required documentation to show one thing, while the cargo was something else entirely. Faro was hired specifically for that function. He was good at it. He had no history and no apparent ambitions toward one, and he did the work for 8 years and 4 months without asking questions he didn't need to ask." I said, "And then?" She said, "And then a client named Edmund Harp entered the picture." She removed a photograph from the case and placed it on the desk facing Wolfe. A man in his mid-60s, soft-featured, prosperous, with the particular vacancy that settles behind the eyes of people who have spent a lifetime being told yes. She said, Edmund Harp, third-generation pharmaceutical money, 67 years old at the time of his death, which occurred 11 weeks ago. Heart failure, announced quietly. His estate is currently in probate in Westchester County. He maintained a 40-acre property with purpose-built enclosures and staff under comprehensive non-disclosure agreements, and his interest for the past 15 years was the acquisition of exotic animals, specifically animals that the legitimate market cannot supply, specifically animals that do not, in any official sense, exist. She let that sit. She said Harp was diagnosed with the cardiac condition that killed him approximately 14 weeks ago. He died 11 weeks ago. The acquisition I'm going to show you arrived at the Red Hook warehouse 6 weeks before his death, which means someone in the acquisition network decided to complete the transaction regardless of whether Harp would live to take delivery. They completed it because the transaction itself had value beyond Harp's collection. The documentation of its completion gave the network leverage, and because what arrived in that warehouse was the kind of thing that serious people build careers around having moved. Wolfe said, and Faro. She said, Faro performed the intake documentation for the shipment. He opened the container for his standard verification. What he found inside was not on any manifest and had not been disclosed to him in advance. Someone above his level in Meridian's secondary hierarchy had added it at the origin point in India. She reached into the document case one final time. She placed a second photograph on Wolfe's desk. I want to be precise about the next 30 seconds in that office. The photograph was taken at night, through a container door left slightly open, with a flash that caught the interior at a low angle. The space inside had been modified, padding on the walls, ventilation at the base, dark material covering the floor. In the back of that space, lying on its side with the particular ease of something that has decided where it is, was an animal. A tiger. The size and the shape were unmistakable, but the color was wrong. She was black, not dark-striped in the way I had seen discussed in footnotes of zoological literature, not the pseudo-melanistic variation where markings thicken and merge. Black the way deep water is black. At the shoulder and along the flank, where the photograph's angled flash caught her coat exactly right, I could see the stripes surfacing, dark on darker, like words written in the same ink as the page, visible only when the light found them. I heard Faro's voice from the Friday call in my head, something that shouldn't exist. Not a figure of speech, a literal description. He had opened a container in Red Hook and found the living proof of something the world had decided was no longer possible, and he had called this office twice and put a Wednesday appointment in his wallet and been building toward the moment he could sit in this room and say those exact words. I said, that is what he meant. Claudette looked at me. She said yes. Wolfe had not moved. He was looking at the photograph with an expression I have seen perhaps a dozen times in 11 years of working for him, the expression of a man who has encountered something that meets his private standard for what the world is capable of producing and is taking a moment to fully acknowledge it before proceeding. He gets it with certain orchids. He got it once with a Bach performance in this room. He was getting it now. He said, quietly, "How long has she been in that warehouse?" Claudette said 6 weeks, since the shipment arrived, and for all 6 of those weeks, Daniel Faro had been going to that warehouse in the evenings after his official hours at his own expense to maintain her. He had no background in animal care. He taught himself as he went. He sourced appropriate food through channels that cost him money he did not have to spare. He modified the container's existing ventilation. He monitored the temperature controls and corrected them twice when the seasonal change affected the system. He did all of this in complete secret, without telling anyone at Meridian, because he had opened that container and looked at what was inside and made a decision about what kind of person he was going to be. The office was quiet for a moment. I thought about what that description contained. A man in an industry built entirely on not asking questions, who had spent 9 years asking none, opening a container one evening and finding something that broke every category he had for what the world contained, and choosing, without training and without instruction and without anyone to tell him it was the right thing, to be its keeper, Wolfe said, and then someone killed him. Claudette said yes, and whoever killed him either did not know she was in that container, or knew and was deciding what to do about her. Either way, her situation was precarious, and her time was limited. Wolfe looked at the photograph for another long moment. He said, "Archie, call Detective Voss. Tell her I have substantive information about the Faro case and propose a meeting at the warehouse this afternoon. If she objects, tell her the information concerns the manner of death specifically and that the distinction will matter considerably to her case." I picked up the phone. Before I dialed, I looked at the photograph one more time, at the black tiger in the modified container, lying in that darkness with the ease of something that had assessed its situation and concluded that calm was the most available and most useful response. I thought Faro looked at her and stayed. I made the call. Chapter 3. Red Hook. Renata Voss was 43 and carried the particular exhaustion of a detective who is genuinely good at her job. Not the exhaustion of failure, but the kind that accumulates when competence is in continuous demand and never fully restocked. She met us at the Van Dyke Street warehouse at 4 o'clock with 2 officers and the expression of someone who has agreed to terms and is already examining their fine print. She shook Wolfe's hand without ceremony. She said, "I appreciate you coming in person, Mr. Wolfe. I know it's not your practice." He said an unusual case warrants unusual adjustments. She looked at him the way people look at Wolfe when they're trying to determine whether the reputation is constructed or actual. Then she looked at me. I gave her the small nod that means he is genuinely like this. It is not a performance. She walked us through what they had. Faro had been in the warehouse alone the previous evening, consistent with his documented pattern of late documentation work on incoming shipments. The container that shifted was a standard freight unit, 700 kilos. The crushing injury was consistent with the physical evidence at the scene. No interior cameras. The owner, Gerald Corte, maintained exterior surveillance only. The footage showed Faro arriving at 9:14. No other arrivals or departures were recorded until the building manager found him at 11:40. Wolfe listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "I would like your forensics team to re-examine the base, securing clamps on the container in question. Specifically, I want them to look for evidence of deliberate manipulation, loosened fasteners, tool marks inconsistent with standard wear, anything suggesting the failure was engineered rather than incidental." Voss looked at him steadily. She said, "Are you telling me this was constructed?" He said, "I am telling you precisely what to look for. The conclusion belongs to your team." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned to one of her officers and said, "Call Chen. Tell him I need a second pass on the securing hardware before he signs the equipment release." She looked back at Wolfe. "The results will come to me by phone. What I show you in the meantime is professional courtesy, not evidence sharing. Are we clear on that?" He said completely. She took us in. The warehouse had the smell of places where things arrive from far away, and weight, salt and metal, and something organic underneath, the accumulated atmosphere of distance. There was a forensics marker on the floor near the main entrance where Faro had been found. I looked at it and moved past it, and kept moving. The containers were arrayed in 2 rows along the longer walls, standard freight, numbered, manifested. Wolfe moved along them with a slowness that was not hesitation, it was examination. He reads a scene the way other people read text, building the picture from its physical components before anyone tells him what the picture is supposed to show. His eyes went to the base of each container as we passed, and to the door seals, and to the ventilation modifications where they existed. He stopped at a unit near the east wall, green 40 feet, marked with a Taiwanese shipping identifier. He stood back and looked at the whole of it. He crouched, This took effort, and he did not acknowledge the effort, and neither did I, and examined the base ventilation closely. He stood. He looked at Voss. He said, "Open it." She said, "That unit has been processed and cleared." He said, "I know. Open it." She studied him. Then she nodded to the second officer. The doors opened. I am going to describe what was in that container with the care it deserves, because imprecision would be a disservice to what Daniel Farrow had built in 6 weeks with no training and limited means. He had lined the interior walls with moving blankets, overlapped and stapled at the seams. A portable HVAC unit, the kind used in server room temperature management, compact and effective, ran from a power line he had routed through a modification in the container floor. The modification was clean, professionally done, which told me he had paid someone for that specific piece. Rubber matting covered the base, and over the matting he had laid compressed sisal fiber, the kind legitimate zoological transport operations use for large animal flooring. 2 gravity-fed water tanks were mounted to the upper interior wall. A feeding mechanism near the right wall had been restocked within the past 48 hours. In the back left corner, on a raised platform of the same sisal material, Lila was lying on her side. Voss made a sound that was not a word. The second officer said something I am not going to record, because the moment deserves better than what he said. I said nothing. I was looking at the black tiger in the space that a decent man had built for her at the cost of everything he had to spare, and I was feeling 2 things simultaneously: the specific cold anger that comes when someone careful and good gets erased by someone careless and not good, and something that took me longer to name, something adjacent to gratitude for the 6 weeks Farrow had been given to do something right with what he found. Wolfe was in the container doorway. He had been still since the doors opened. He was looking at Lila with the photograph expression from the office, and underneath it, something older and less nameable that I had not seen before and have thought about many times since. Lila raised her head. She looked at the doorway. She looked at Voss and the officer, and at me with the complete evaluative attention she brought to everything, not assessing danger, not preparing a response, simply and fully looking, with the quality of presence that belongs to things that have never needed to be anything other than exactly what they are. Then she looked at Wolfe, and she stayed there. Wolfe said quietly, without turning detective, "How many people know this container exists?" Voss said, "My team, the building manager, Korta," he said, "and the people who put her here." She said yes. He said, "In the chain of official response that begins the moment you formally document this container's contents, how long before she enters a legal and institutional process that she will not survive?" Voss was quiet. He said, "I am not asking you to falsify anything or obstruct anything. I am asking for 48 hours before the formal documentation of this specific container's contents. In that time, I will give you everything necessary to reclassify this death, identify who is responsible, and build a case that holds completely. This container's contents are a separate matter from your homicide investigation, and I am offering to make that separation clean and permanent." Voss looked at Lila. She looked at Wolfe's back. Then she looked at me. I gave her a nod. I meant honestly, not the nod that says trust him because he's usually right, but the nod that says this is one of the times when what he's asking is genuinely the right thing, regardless of whether it's the procedurally comfortable thing. She was quiet long enough that I counted to 7. She said 48 hours, after which I need something I can build on. Wolfe said, "You will have considerably more than that." She turned to her officers. She said, "Let's go back to the exterior footage and work the timeline again from the east entrance." She didn't look back at the container. Her officers followed her. Wolfe and I stood in the Red Hook warehouse with the black tiger and the careful room that Farrow had built, and the late afternoon light coming through the high windows in long pale columns. I said, "We need to move her tonight." He said, "Call the man who doesn't ask questions." I said, "He asks some." He said, "Tell him not to tonight." I stepped outside and made the call. Chapter 4. The Brownstone. Late, I called Fritz from the parking lot while I was waiting for Del Vargas to answer. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. The essential points, what was coming, approximate weight and dimensions, the lower room off the kitchen connecting to the walled garden, and the requirement that this be absorbed without institutional disruption, were received by Fritz with the quiet he reserves for things that are unprecedented, but not, he has decided, unsurvivable. He asked what she ate. I said I would confirm that within the hour. He said he would need the evening, and therefore dinner was cancelled, and he would make the Moroccan lamb for the following day's lunch as compensation. I said Wolfe wouldn't accept that. Fritz said Wolfe's acceptance was a matter Fritz would adjudicate personally, and I should focus on the logistics. I relayed this to Wolfe. Wolfe said the Moroccan lamb was insufficient. Then he was quiet for a long moment, standing at the edge of the warehouse parking lot, looking at nothing in particular. Then he said, acceptable, in the tone of a man conceding something he didn't want to win anyway. Del Vargas arrived 40 minutes later with 2 men whose primary professional quality was that they had learned the value of silence and charged accordingly for it. Moving Lila from the original container to Del's larger transport unit required patience and spatial reasoning and a complete absence of any action that could be interpreted as aggressive, and the 3 of them managed it with the efficiency of people who intend to be somewhere else as soon as professionally possible. Leela observed the process from her corner, with the full evaluative attention she brought to everything, and then when the new container was positioned and aligned and the way through was clear, she stood and walked through it with the unhurried directness of something that has made a decision. Del watched this and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he raised his fee by 20%, and I accepted without negotiating. We reached West 35th Street at 8:40. Fritz had done extraordinary things in 4 hours. The lower room had been cleared and the sisal matting was down. I did not ask how he had sourced it at that hour, and he offered no explanation, which is one of the qualities I most respect in Fritz. The water vessels were in place. Against the wall near the garden door, he had arranged a quantity of raw meat from a source he also did not specify. The temperature had been adjusted to a number he had evidently researched himself. A heavy sliding bolt had been installed on the interior connecting door, sourced, purchased and mounted in under 4 hours, which confirmed something about Fritz that I already knew but was glad to have confirmed. Del's men brought the container through the garden entrance and positioned it against the garden wall. They opened the doors and stepped well back. Nothing happened for a long time. Then Leila walked out. She moved through the garden entrance into the lower room and stopped in the center and did what she had done in the warehouse. She stood and she assessed, not frantically, not with the distressed restlessness of an animal in an unfamiliar space, with the deliberate completeness of something taking a full account before committing to a position. She turned her head slowly and her gaze moved through the room, the water, the food, the garden door open to the October night, Fritz in the kitchen doorway, me by the stairs, Wolfe standing against the far wall. Her gaze reached Wolfe and stayed. He was in the posture he uses when he is waiting for information to arrive, still, weight settled back, hands at his sides. He did not move toward her. He did not make any gesture of invitation or welcome or reassurance. He stood and allowed himself to be examined with the same quality of simple availability he'd had in the warehouse doorway, and watching him I understood that this was not strategy, not a deliberate animal handling approach. It was simply who Wolfe was in the presence of something that deserved his honest full attention. Nothing withheld and nothing performed. Leela crossed the room to him. She moved in a straight line without hurrying and stopped 4 feet from where he stood. She sat. She looked up at him. Wolfe looked down at her. His left hand opened at his side. Not reaching out, nothing that forward or that presumptuous. The fingers extended slightly, palm toward the floor, the way you leave a door ajar for someone who hasn't decided yet whether to come through it. Leela looked at his open hand. She looked at his face. Then she turned and walked to the space Fritz had prepared and lay down. Wolfe's hand closed. He went upstairs without a word to anyone. Dell's men left with the particular speed of people who have decided this evening counts as a story they will tell indefinitely. Dell himself stopped in the garden entrance. He looked at the room and at Lila settling into the sisal and at me. He said, "Goodwin, what is that?" I said, "A tiger." He said, "That is a black tiger." I said, "Yes." He said, "Those don't exist." I said, "I know." He looked at me for a moment. I didn't try to fill. Then he said the original fee had been too low, collected his men, and was gone. Fritz remained in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Leela with the attention of a man conducting a formal introduction, and having concluded that the introduction required certain terms to be established from the beginning. He spoke to her in Swiss German, low and serious, the tone of a man who is accustomed to running a demanding household, and intends this new variable to understand the operational parameters. I do not speak Swiss German. The meaning was entirely clear. Leela's left ear rotated once. Fritz nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose terms have been acknowledged. He turned back to his kitchen. I stood in the room alone for another minute, looking at the October dark through the open garden door and at the black tiger in the corner, settling her mass into the prepared space with the slow completeness of something finding a position it intends to hold. I thought about Faro in a warehouse in Red Hook at night, restocking the water delivery system, checking the temperature readings, doing the unglamorous patient work of keeping a life going that had no official category and no institutional support. I thought he would have liked this room. I went upstairs and typed my notes until well past midnight. Fritz came up at some point and left a plate outside my door without knocking, which is his way of acknowledging a difficult evening without making a production of it. I ate without tasting it and kept typing. Chapter 5. Voss calls, then Claudette. Wednesday morning. Voss called at 9:10. She said her forensics team had re-examined the base securing clamps on the container. Tool marks, deliberate manipulation of the fasteners, recent inconsistent with standard wear. The oxidation pattern dated the manipulation to between 2 and 4 hours before Faro's arrival. The mechanism had been engineered to fail under load redistribution at a specific point along the east wall, which was precisely where Faro positioned himself during late documentation work, a pattern that anyone familiar with his routine would have known. She said, "You were right. This was built." I said, "Wolfe will want you here this morning, along with Claudette Brown, who has research bearing on the case." She said, "I'll be there at 11. I knocked on the office door. Wolfe was at his desk with his first beer and a volume of Gibbon. I gave him the Voss summary and said Claudette would need to be called as well. He said, "Call her and bring me the HARP file before they arrive." I called Claudette. Then I retrieved the file she had sent over the previous day and read it cover to cover in the hour before the meeting. The file was the product of 3 weeks of Claudette's research. She had begun it, she told me later, not because of Faro, but because of an anomaly in a Meridian Customs filing that had surfaced through a source she declined to name. The Faro referral had come after the foundation was already built, which explained the file's depth, and which meant everything in it was independently sourced and not dependent on Faro's account. Edmund Harp's biography was the biography of a man who had inherited wealth and a psychology in roughly equal measure. He didn't engage with his animals. Former estate staff, interviewed by Claudette off the record, were consistent on this. He rarely visited the enclosures. He didn't know the animals individually. What he maintained was a private archive documenting their provenance, proof of acquisition, because what Harp wanted was not the animal, but the knowledge that he had the thing that couldn't be had. The collection was, in the end, an elaborate and expensive form of keeping score with a world that had never told him no. The India section gave me the acquisition network. A man named Prem Anand operated out of Odisha, a logistics facilitator who connected acquisition sources to clients through documentation systems that had stayed clean for 14 years by being careful in all the ways that mattered. He was not a poacher, he was architecture, the kind of architecture that made other people's worst impulses operationally possible and maintained a professional remove from the physical reality of what he facilitated. At the bottom of the India section, Claudette had written a handwritten marginal note, the kind she reserved for things confirmed enough to record, but too recent for the main document body. It said, and arrived in New York 8 days ago on a business visa. According to my source, his arrival was triggered by a specific communication 11 days ago, a documentation irregularity at the Indian origin point that generated a paper trail connecting the Odisha acquisition to Meridian's secondary account structure. The irregularity was flagged internally by a compliance review that Meridian initiated after Harpe's death and the opening of the estate probate. The probate process requires Meridian to account for all active client transactions. The flag created exposure for the network above Meridian and was sent to assess and contain before the probate attorneys find the thread. I read that twice. Then I read the date of Pharaoh's death. The compliance flag had been raised 11 days ago and had arrived 8 days ago. Pharaoh had died 6 days ago. The sequence was a machine. Someone had looked at the timeline and made a calculation. I underlined the marginal note and put the file on Wolfe's desk. Voss arrived at 11. Claudette arrived 12 minutes later. I put them both in the office, Claudette in the red chair, Voss in the additional chair to the right, Wolfe behind his desk, me at mine. Fritz brought coffee without being asked. He placed the tray on the side table with the quiet precision that is his version of acknowledging that the room's business was serious, and he withdrew without a word or a look. I have always appreciated that Fritz reads a room. Voss laid out what her team had confirmed, the tool marks, the deliberate engineering, the timeline. She had 3 people with legitimate after-hours access and alibis that held from the initial canvas, which meant either the alibis had gaps she hadn't found yet, or the person who built the mechanism had acted during regular business hours and had not needed to be present when it triggered. Wolfe said the latter. The mechanism was built hours before Pharaoh arrived by someone who knew his routine and did not need to be on site to be certain it would function. This is either professional work or work guided by a professional, Voss said, pointing toward who. Claudette said, "May I?" Wolfe gestured. She told Voss everything she had told us the previous afternoon: the harp connection, Meridian's secondary function, the acquisition, the 6 weeks of Pharaoh's maintenance, and what had arrived in that warehouse. She presented it in the clean sequential order that is her best professional quality, and she included the marginal note about Anand, his arrival, its trigger, the compliance flag, and the probate timeline that had created the exposure. I watched Voss absorb this. She was a good detective, which meant she was also a good listener. She held the incoming information without reacting to each piece, building the complete picture before rendering judgment on any part of it. When Claudette finished, Voss said, "So the killing was about silencing a witness who was already reaching out." Wolfe said, "A witness with 9 years of operational knowledge of Meridian's secondary functions, who had made direct contact with an outside investigator, and who was maintaining physical evidence of an acquisition that had generated network exposure through the probate process. He was not merely a liability, he was an active threat to a 14-year operational record." Voss said, "And the man who came to contain the threat." Wolfe said, "Anand assessed the problem and determined its scope. He is a logistics man. His instinct would have been to relocate Pharaoh or buy him. Someone above Anand made a different calculation." He paused. "Find Anand, detective. He is the path to the person who made that calculation. He is not the person who made it." Voss said, "If I move on him and he runs..." Wolfe said, "I will find him first and speak with him. Then I will tell you where he is." He looked at her levelly. "Is that arrangement acceptable?" She studied him for a long moment. She said, "Within the 48 hours." He said, "Well within." She left. Claudette stayed. Wolfe said, "The vehicle. You mentioned a documentation irregularity at the origin point. What physical evidence connects Meridian's secondary account structure to the network above it? Claudette said, I have been building that connection for 3 weeks. There is private security footage from a camera on the building across from the Red Hook warehouse. A residential building installed it after a break-in 2 years ago. The footage from the relevant evening between 6 and 8 p.m. shows a vehicle parked on the street for 23 minutes. I obtained the footage through a source in the building's management company. She opened the document case and placed a still photograph on the desk. A vehicle, time-stamped, visible and clear. The vehicle is registered to a shell company. The shell company, when you follow its corporate filings through 3 jurisdictions, connects to a holding company with one name in its formation documents. She placed a second sheet next to the photograph. I looked at the name. I wrote it down. Then I looked at what I had written and understood immediately and completely why Daniel Faro had needed to be dead before his Wednesday appointment. Wolfe looked at the name. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said the federal layer. Claudette said, yes. He said, this goes to Harris at the federal field office, not through Kramer. The homicide documentation is Kramer's. The network and the financial principal, a federal jurisdiction. He paused. And Archie, and Art. Tonight, I was already reaching for my notebook. Chapter 6. Prem Anand. Woodside, finding and took me the rest of Wednesday, and required working backward from his visa entry through a contact at a freight forwarding company, who owed me a favor of the kind paid in information rather than money. He was in a short-term rental in Woodside, under a name that combined his real first name with a different last name, credible enough for the rental agency's verification standard, which was not designed with him in mind. Before I went to him, I spent an hour building the human dimensions of the professional outline Claudette had provided, and was 54. He had spent his career in the geography between official and unofficial commerce, not a violent man. Nothing in 14 years of operational history suggested personal violence as an instrument he reached for. He was a builder and maintainer of systems. He understood that systems had value only as long as they remained invisible, and that anything threatening visibility had to be managed before it became a threat to the principles above the system. Those principles were the people you genuinely could not afford to compromise, and Anand had spent 14 years making sure they never had to be. Faro had threatened visibility. The compliance flag had threatened it further, and had come to manage both, and had arrived to find that someone above him had already managed Faro, using a tool he wouldn't have recommended, because dead men generated investigations, and investigations were the structural enemy of everything he had spent 14 years building. I knocked on the door of the Woodside rental at 10:15 in the morning. He opened it with the expression of a man who has been expecting something unpleasant and is experiencing, upon its arrival, the particular relief of the waiting being over. He was small, neat, precise in the way that people who operate in careful systems become precise, wire-rimmed glasses, good shoes, the stillness of someone who had learned young that drawing attention was expensive. He said, "You're Goodwin?" I said yes. He said, "I have been wondering when Wolfe would send someone. Come in." The apartment was spare in the way that people who don't intend to stay somewhere keep spaces spare. Minimal personal items, nothing unpacked that didn't serve a function. The cleanliness of maintained operational flexibility. He sat across a small table from me and folded his hands on its surface and said, "I did not arrange Faro's death. I want that established first." I said, "I know." He looked at me. He said, "You know." I said, "You're a systems man." Systems men don't kill witnesses, they relocate them or buy them. Faro's death generated exactly the kind of investigation your network has spent 14 years avoiding. If the decision had been yours, Faro would have received a number with several zeros on it and a strong professional suggestion to accept a position at a freight company in another city. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Yes, that is precisely correct." I said, "So who gave the order?" He said, "A man named Calloway. He works in a security capacity for the principals above me, the financial layer. He acts on instructions I am not given in advance. The decision to act on Faro was made above both of us by people who decided that the combination of the compliance flag, the probate exposure, and Faro's contact with your office created a risk level that required immediate resolution, a pause. They were not wrong about the risk level. They were wrong about the method. I said, and you're here because Faro's death didn't resolve the exposure. He said Faro was one node. The irregularity is structural, and Faro had been building insurance. I said, tell me about the insurance. He said for approximately 10 months. Faro maintained a private record of the transactions he personally facilitated. Not comprehensive, only what he handled directly, only what he verified himself, but detailed. Dates, container numbers, his own internal references, names where he had confirmed them. He was building a door. Calloway has been in this city for 8 days, specifically to find where that door leads before anyone else does. I said, does Calloway know about Claudette Brown? And looked at his folded hands. He said yes. She helped Faro identify what was in the container. He consulted her when the shipment arrived, and he didn't know what he was looking at. Calloway has her photograph and her address. I was already reaching for my phone. I called Claudette from the car. She answered on the first ring, and before I could speak she said, someone has been in my office. This morning while I was out, professional, nothing obviously displaced, nothing obviously taken, but I know my space, and someone went through it systematically. I said they were looking for Faro's records. She said yes, which tells you the records aren't there. A pause, which is correct. I've been doing this for 20 years, Archie. I know when I stop being the researcher and become the story. I prepared for this 4 days ago. I said, come to the brownstone. She said, I was already heading there. I called Wolfe and gave him the summary in the 4 minutes it took me to navigate back toward Manhattan. He listened and said one thing when I finished. He said, Calloway, physical description. I called Anand back. He sent me a photograph. Calloway was 38, broad-shouldered, with a face that occupied the precise perceptual middle of every room he entered. Not memorable, not forgettable, calibrated somehow to register as neither. Former military, Anand said, former several other things. Currently contracted to the holding company whose name Claudette had placed on Wolfe's desk the previous afternoon. I drove back to West 35th Street. Fritz met me at the door with the expression he uses when something in the house has shifted and he wants me to know it before I walk further in. He said, she has been different this afternoon. I said, Lila. He said, she has been watching the entrance corridor, not the garden, the front of the house. He paused. She is aware that the situation outside has changed. I cannot explain to you the mechanism of this knowledge, Archie. I can only tell you that I have been watching her for 2 days, and she is not a difficult animal to read once you stop expecting her to communicate the way a domestic animal communicates. I looked at him for a moment. He said, she knows. I went inside. Chapter 7. What Faro built. Claudette arrived at 4 and came directly to the office. She sat in the red chair and placed on Wolfe's desk, without preamble, a slip of paper, 12 characters, alphanumeric, a cloud storage access code. She said, Faro gave me this 7 days before he died. He said if anything happened to him, I should use my judgment about who received it. He knew what he was carrying. He was not under any illusions about the risks. Wolfe said, and your judgment produced this address. She said, he called your office twice. He had your address in his wallet with a Wednesday appointment. Whatever he needed from you, he needed it enough to keep trying after the first call didn't get through. I decided the records should go to the person he had been trying to reach. Wolfe said, Archie, I sat at my desk and entered the access code. What Faro had built over 10 months was the record of a careful man doing careful work with the materials available to him. He had documented what he personally handled and personally confirmed. Nothing more, nothing less. Dates, container numbers, Meridian's internal transaction references. His own observations written in the flat factual register of someone who understood that interpretation was a liability and that facts presented cleanly spoke for themselves. He had included nothing he hadn't verified. He had excluded nothing he had. Within that scope, the records were precise and complete. The transactional thread they created, connecting specific container movements to specific Meridian account references, to specific shell company identifiers, to the holding company's formation documents, was the connective tissue that would allow investigators with the right jurisdiction to build the complete structural case. The records were not the whole picture. They were the thread that, when pulled, would unravel the whole picture. Archie's corporate unwinding of the holding company had identified the financial principle. Unden's testimony connected the principle to the operational network. Claudette's 3 weeks of independent research provided the organizational context. Faro's records provided the transactional proof. Together they were sufficient. At the bottom of the final page, beneath the last transaction entry, Faro had written a paragraph that was different in voice from everything preceding it. 3 sentences, the only personal thing in 10 months of records. I read it aloud to the room. He had written, "I don't know who will read this or whether it will be used. I have done what I could with what I had access to. The animal in Container 7 is not documentation or evidence or a prize. She is the last of something, and she deserves to live in a place where someone knows that about her." The office was quiet. From downstairs I could hear Leela moving through the lower room, that particular quality that was not quite sound, the displacement of air by something large moving with complete intention. Wolfe was still. He remained still long enough that I put my pen down and waited. Then he said, "Send the transactional records to Harris at the Federal Field Office. The Faro homicide documentation goes to Kramer separately, the homicide file only, not the financial records. I want Kramer to close the Faro case. I want federal jurisdiction on the principal and the network." He paused. "The immediate problem is Callaway. Documentation does not solve Callaway." Claudette said, "It might." Wolfe looked at her. She said, "The records are backed up in 4 independent locations. If anything happens to me, to Archie, to you, or to this building, the access code goes simultaneously to 3 journalists and 2 federal addresses. This has been arranged since the morning after Faro died." She paused. "I communicated this to an intermediary connected to the holding company this afternoon, before I came here." Wolfe looked at her for a moment with the expression he reserves for things that meet his private standard. He said, "I have heard that sound from Wolfe, perhaps 12 times in 11 years. Claudette received it with the composure of someone who had been hoping for it and was not going to let that hope show. I said, so the mandate gets withdrawn." Wolfe said, "It is being withdrawn now, but Callaway is a professional and I want confirmation before we treat the matter as resolved. A professional in his position confirms instructions personally before acting on them. He will be in this city until he receives that confirmation." He looked at me. "Find him tonight." I found him at 9:15 in a diner in Astoria. He was at a corner table, eating a sandwich with the unhurried appetite of a man with no immediate professional obligations, and when I walked in and he looked up, he showed no surprise, the expression of someone who has been expecting contact and has chosen a neutral location for it. I sat across from him without invitation. We assessed each other the way 2 people do when they know precisely who the other is and have agreed, without saying so, to be civil about it. He said, "The mandate is withdrawn. Your principal's communication reached the right people and they made the correct calculation." I said, "I'm here to confirm that in person." He said, "Confirmed." He took a measured bite of his sandwich. "I'm on a flight to Toronto tomorrow morning." I said, "Daniel Faro." He put the sandwich down. Something moved behind his eyes, not guilt, which I don't think was an instrument Callaway maintained in regular use, something more like acknowledgement. The expression of a man taking inventory of a specific item. He said, "I follow instructions." The instruction in that case came from above my contact level. That is the operational context. I said, I'm noting it. He said, I know. He looked out the diner window at the Astoria Street. Then, without looking back at me, he said, the animal, in the warehouse. A pause. I looked into the container when I was assessing the warehouse. He stopped. He said, is she all right? I sat with that for a moment. There are things that surprise me less than they used to. Working for Wolfe. There are things that still surprise me completely. A man like Calloway, asking that question in that voice in this kind of conversation, was the second kind. I said, she's fine. She's somewhere good. He nodded once. He picked up his sandwich. He looked out the window. I left him there and drove back to Manhattan. Chapter 8. The demonstration. Let me explain something about how Wolfe resolves cases, because it matters here, and because the people who mistake it for performance have missed the point. Wolfe demonstrates. He assembles the relevant parties in the office and presents the complete sequence from evidence to mechanism to conclusion, not to show what he knows, but to allow the people in the room to follow each step and arrive at the conclusion themselves. He wants the sequence to be traceable. He wants to be challenged at every point where a challenge is possible, because a challenge that cannot hold is proof, and proof is what he is actually after. On Thursday morning, the office held Kramer in the red chair and Voss to his right. Claudette was present at the side of the room. I was at my desk. Wolfe was behind his. Kramer had arrived with the expression he always brings to these meetings, the expression of a man who has been doing his job carefully and competently and is about to discover the portion of the picture he had been standing too close to see. He put his hat on his knee and looked at Wolfe with the practiced wariness of someone who has learned that wariness is appropriate and has never found a better response. Wolfe said, I will give you the sequence. You will tell me where it disagrees with your evidence. Surface and the secondary function, the account hierarchy designed to keep the financial layer insulated from physical cargo. He gave them HARP, the client, the collection, the death and the probate, and the compliance review. He gave them the acquisition, the shipment from Odisha, the documentation irregularity at the origin point, the arrival at Red Hook 6 weeks before Harp's death, and the significance of that timing. He gave them Faro, all of it, the 9 years of invisible professional competence, the evening he opened a container and found something that reorganized his accounting of himself, the 6 weeks of maintenance, the 2 calls to this office, the Wednesday appointment written on the back of a business card. He gave them the compliance flag that had triggered his arrival 8 days before Faro's death, the operational logic that would have argued against the action ultimately taken, the mandate that had been issued above his level. He gave them the mechanism, the warehouse, the container, the engineered securing clamps, the oxidation timeline that placed their manipulation during regular business hours by someone who knew Faro's routine and did not need to be present when it triggered. He gave them Calloway, the security contractor, the connection to the holding company through the shell company structure, the vehicle on the Red Hook Street in the relevant window caught on private building security footage that Claudette had obtained through her building management source. He placed the vehicle photograph and the corporate filings on the desk. He placed Calloway's photograph beside them. He said the financial principal whose name appears in the holding company's formation documents commissioned the action through Calloway. The transactional records connecting Meridian's secondary account structure to the principal's shell company are in the federal file. The evidentiary chain connecting Calloway to the vehicle and the vehicle to the principal is in the file I am about to give you. Kramer had been writing. He looked up. He said, the vehicle footage, a private building camera. Wolfe said, obtained legally through the building management company by Miss Brown. Yes. Kramer said, that's the connection between Calloway and the holding company. Without it, you have Calloway as a contractor with no provable link to the specific instruction. Wolfe said correct, which is why the footage is the linchpin. Without it, the chain has a gap. With it, the chain is complete. Kramer looked at the photograph. He turned it at an angle. He said the plate is partially obscured. Wolfe said the last 3 characters are visible. combined with the vehicle make and model and the time window, there are 4 registered vehicles that match. Only one is connected to a shell company in the holding structure. The registration records are in the file. Kramer sat with that for a moment. He looked at Voss. She gave him a slight nod that said she had already followed this chain, and it held. He looked back at Wolfe. He said Calloway's location. Wolfe said Toronto, as of this morning. Archie confirmed his departure intent personally last night. He paused. He will cooperate. He understands his position. Kramer wrote something else in his notebook. He looked at what he had written. He said, "This is federal on the principle." Wolfe said, "Harris at the Federal Field Office received the transactional records this morning. You will receive cooperation and documentation through the appropriate channels. The Faro homicide is yours completely." He produced 2 files and slid them across the desk, one for Kramer, containing everything relevant to the homicide case, and one for Voss, containing the parallel investigative chain she would need for her own records. Kramer took his file. He looked at it. He looked at Wolfe, with the expression that cycles through skepticism and recognition and arrives at the professional satisfaction of a case he can close, threaded through with the frustration of owing that satisfaction to Nero Wolfe. He has this expression with some regularity and has never resolved its internal contradictions. I have always respected him for continuing to sit with them. He stood. He put his hat on. He said, "Wolfe, the warehouse." Wolfe said nothing. Kramer said, "My team found a recently vacated container on their second pass. You were on scene the afternoon before." Wolfe said, "You have a homicide to close, Inspector. You have a federal referral to prepare. You have a financier whose lawyers are about to become very occupied." He picked up his book. "The warehouse inventory is a separate matter from the Faro investigation, and it is being handled." Kramer looked at him. He looked at me. I gave him nothing, which was the right thing to give him, and which he recognized as such. He said, "I'll want to talk about this again at some point." Wolfe said, "I expect so." Kramer left. Voss followed a few minutes after, with her file and a handshake for Claudette that lasted a beat longer than professional courtesy required, and communicated what the preceding 48 hours had cost her, and what she thought about how Claudette had carried them. Claudette stayed until both of them had cleared the front steps. Then she looked at Wolfe and said, "The records remain in 4 locations until the federal case is formally opened and the principal is in custody." He said, "Correct." She said, "After that." He said, "After that, they are Faro's records. Their disposition is a question of his legacy and not mine." She was quiet for a moment. She picked up her document case and stood. She said, "His sister is in Philadelphia. Amara." She didn't know the full scope of what her brother was doing, but she knew he was frightened, and she knew he was trying to do something about it. She called me after he died. Wolfe said, "And?" She said, "I told her I would let her know if what he was trying to do had mattered." Wolfe said, "It mattered considerably. Tell her so." He paused. "Tell her also that he was thorough and he was honest and that the case was made because of what he built. She should know that specifically." Claudette looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded and left. I sat at my desk after the room had emptied. From downstairs I could hear Fritz in the kitchen and the small sounds of the brownstone going about its afternoon. Through the floor I could feel, more than hear, the particular weight of Leela moving through the lower room. I thought about Faro's sister in Philadelphia receiving a call on a Wednesday afternoon. I thought about what it was to hear that your brother had been frightened and careful and thorough and right and had not gotten to see any of it resolved. I went back to my files. Chapter 9. 3 week. 3 weeks is not long enough to change a house. It is long enough for a house to reveal what it was already becoming. The formal record of those 3 weeks is brief. Calloway was arrested in Toronto on a Friday and extradited to New York the following Tuesday. He entered a cooperation agreement on the Thursday after his return. The arithmetic of his situation, as Wolfe had predicted, was not complicated once he was looking directly at it. Marcus Inlet, The Meridian account manager, whose connection to the shell company's street vehicle had been the thread Voss needed on the homicide side, was picked up by a separate team on the same Thursday and reached the same arithmetic in less time. The federal case opened formally 12 days after Wolfe gave Harris the records. The financial principal released a statement through 4 lawyers. The statement was confident in a way I found impressive given what was bearing down on it. Kramer visited the brownstone 3 times. On the first visit, he needed information. On the second visit, he needed clarification. On the third visit, he stayed 40 minutes, and during that time, he discussed the Faro case, the Callaway extradition, and 2 unrelated matters. At no point during any of the 3 visits did he directly ask the question. I could see positioned behind his eyes every time his gaze moved slightly past me, toward the lower corridor. On the third visit, as he was leaving, he stopped in the office doorway. He didn't turn around. He said, "Wolfe, the Faro file closes pending trial." Wolfe said, "Yes." Kramer said, "I read his complete records, the homicide file. He included a personal paragraph at the end of his final entry." Wolfe said nothing. Kramer recited the last sentence from memory. "She is the last of something, and she deserves to live in a place where someone knows that about her." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Good instincts for a logistics man." He walked out without waiting for anything in response. I looked at Wolfe. He had his book open. He turned a page. Voss called the same afternoon. Kramer made his 3rd visit. She had heard from the federal team that the case was properly opened and that her homicide chain was being incorporated into the broader investigation. She said, "I wanted you to know that the Faro case is going to be handled correctly, by people who understood what he was doing and what it cost him." I said, "I'll tell Wolfe." She said, "I also wanted to say that whatever was in that container," she paused, "I made the right call. I know I made the right call." I said, "You did." She said, "Good. That's all I needed." Then she hung up, which is very much Voss's way of doing things and which I had come to appreciate. Here is the texture of those 3 weeks, because texture is what makes things real. Lila moved through the brownstone with the complete ease of something that had assessed the space and incorporated it. She had her roots. The lower room to the garden to the kitchen corridor, a circuit she ran each morning at a time that Fritz had calibrated his own schedule around, without announcing the adjustment and without inviting comment on it. She had her positions at different times of day. The morning light came through the garden door at an angle that reached the northeast corner of the lower room, and she was in that corner each morning between 9 and 11, with the settled completeness of a creature doing what the morning called for. Fritz managed their shared territory with the systematic care he brought to everything in the brownstone. By the end of the first week, he had established what she preferred and had begun to account for it, the way he accounted for Wolfe's preferences, as a matter of basic professional respect toward someone whose standards deserved to be credited. He told me at the end of the second week, in the tone of a man reporting a finding rather than expressing an opinion, that she was attentive to the sounds of the kitchen in the morning in a way that told him she had already organized the household schedule internally and knew where everyone was at any given time of day. I said, "Fritz, she's a tiger." He looked at me the way he looks at me when I have said something technically accurate and practically beside the point. He went back to his kitchen. Wolfe's schedule shifted by increments I recorded in my notebook. 15 minutes later, coming downstairs in the mornings, corresponding precisely to the end of Leela's morning circuit and the beginning of her northeast corner position. I did not raise this. He did not raise it. He spent time in the lower room in the evenings. I know this because I am a light sleeper, and I know every floorboard in this house and the route he takes to the kitchen and the route he takes when he's going somewhere else, and in the evenings he took the second route. I never went down during these times. I knew better than to go down during these times, which is itself a form of knowledge about what was happening there. On a Thursday afternoon in the third week, I was at my desk working through correspondence, and I became aware at the edge of my attention of Wolfe's voice from the office, low and deliberate, the cadence of reading aloud. I put my pen down. The connecting door to the office corridor was ajar, and Leela was in the corridor in her afternoon position, and Wolfe was reading from something. I could not distinguish the words through the door, only the voice, which carried the weight he gives to language he considers worth its own full measure. He reads that way privately sometimes. He never reads that way when he knows he is being heard. I sat at my desk and listened without trying to hear. It went on for perhaps 8 minutes. Then the book closed and the office was quiet. I picked up my pen and kept working. That evening at dinner, Fritz had made something with veal that I decided not to analyze because analysis would only diminish it. Wolfe said without preamble or context, not looking up from his plate, "Archie, you were at your desk this afternoon." I said I was working on the Aldrich correspondence. He cut a piece of veal. He said Montaigne, the essay on experience. There is a passage about the relationship between a man's nature and the world's refusal to accommodate it. He ate. I thought she might find it relevant. I looked at him across the table. I said, "Did she?" He said, "She was attentive throughout. She has excellent judgment about what deserves attention." He paused in the way he pauses when he has decided to say one more thing. "She also has excellent judgment about what does not." He went back to his veal. I went back to mine. Outside, the city was doing what it does in late November, getting dark early and staying dark and pressing against the brownstone windows with the comfortable indifference of something enormous that doesn't need to be acknowledged to be present. I thought about what it meant that Wolfe had read Montaigne aloud to a black tiger on a Thursday afternoon in November and considered it an appropriate use of his time. I thought about a man who had spent his career refusing to accommodate the world and who had found in the last of something the world had decided no longer existed, a form of company that did not require accommodation from either direction. I did not say any of that. I finished my veal and thanked Fritz and went upstairs to type my notes. Chapter 10, the last entry. 2 things to close this account. One is a fact and one is a moment, and both belong here. The fact: Daniel Farrow's records were entered into federal evidence on November 19th. His case remains open, pending Calloway's trial. The network above Meridian is being unwound by people with appropriate jurisdiction and the patience to do it properly, and the financial principal whose name appeared in the holding company's formation documents is no longer commenting on international trade policy in publications that previously welcomed his opinions. Hendon returned to Delhi, as arranged. Amara Farrow, Daniel's sister in Philadelphia, received a call from Claudette Brown on a Wednesday morning and was told what her brother had tried to do and how it had mattered, and that the case had been made. I do not know what was said after the initial telling. I know the call lasted a long time, and that Claudette's voice was different when she called me afterward, and I know that I didn't ask about it, because some things are private in a way that should be respected even between people who work closely together. Lila is not on any official registry. She is not part of any estate inventory. She was never on any manifest. She exists, as far as any institutional record is concerned, in the space between one category and the next, which is, it occurs to me, exactly the space she has always occupied. The Harper probate closed without her, because Wolfe has not explained her presence to anyone. He has not needed to. The moment is this. 3 weeks after the case closed on a Tuesday night in November, I came downstairs at 2 in the morning because I couldn't sleep. This happens sometimes after a case, a period of adjustment, the operational alertness needing somewhere to go after the thing driving it has been resolved. The brownstone was dark. The city outside was doing its 2 in the morning version, quieter, the pulse slower, present. I stood at the bottom of the stairs. The lower room was visible from the corridor, the garden door open a few inches to the cold November air, the room dark except for the ambient light of the city coming over the garden wall. Fritz had moved down there, a good reading chair, positioned to face the garden. He was sitting in it the way he sits when he is thinking, rather than reading. Weight settled, no book. Leela was on the floor to his left, not in her prepared sleeping position, closer than that, her mass arranged along the floor, her head toward the garden door. Wolfe's left hand rested at the arm of the chair, fingers slightly extended over the edge. Lila's head was on the floor, 3 inches from his fingertips. Not touching, almost touching. The gap between them, the width of something that had been considered many times and was no longer a question requiring resolution. I stood in the corridor and did not breathe loudly. I thought about a man in a warehouse in Red Hook who had looked at something that should not have existed and had chosen to be responsible for it. I thought about an open hand in a doorway. I thought about the last sentence of a 10-month record. She deserves to live in a place where someone knows that about her. I thought he got it right. He never made it to his Wednesday appointment, and he never got to see any of it, and he got it exactly right anyway. I went back upstairs. I sat at my desk and opened my notebook and wrote one thing. Faro's case is closed. Hers is not. Some things that should not exist do exist, and their existence is not a problem to be resolved. It is a fact to be received. The people who understand the difference are rare. Tonight, in this house, there are 2 of them. 3, if you count Fritz, which I do. I closed the notebook. I looked at the window. The city outside breathed in the way it breathes at 2 in the morning, steadily, without drama, doing what it does. Downstairs in the dark, in a brownstone on West 35th Street, the last black tiger in the world was 3 inches from a man's open hand. Lila remains at the brownstone. Fritz has learned what she prefers. Wolfe has said nothing to anyone about her presence, and no one who has visited this house and become aware of her has pressed the question, which I think says something about the question. Daniel Faro's sister knows what he did. That is the part that matters most.